So have you ever read an article or watched a news story or listened to the experience of a friend and thought, this is not the way that it's supposed to be? And all you read, saw, or heard, it was just too heavy, too unfixable, too overwhelming for you to properly digest. And in that moment, your deepest desire was to just escape from the world and all of the things that feel so irrevocably broken. Maybe you've been in an uncomfortable situation for a long time. And sometimes after a long day, you just want to go home or escape to a place where you can surround yourself with people and situations that make you feel comfortable. Have you ever just wanted to escape? Just take off, disappear, leave all of the drama, all of the expectations, responsibilities, bills, meetings, hurts, fears behind. Well, then I have good news for you. Congratulations, you are human. It is normal for us to wish that we could escape situations that make us feel uncomfortable. I mean, who here wakes up in the morning and thinks, how can I make my life harder, more frustrating, and just a little bit more heartbreaking? No one. We just don't do that, and for good reason, right? But as we've also probably learned, sometimes we need to face difficult and uncontrollable situations. Sometimes we have to overcome our fear of scary things, to get out in the world in order to grow, in order to heal, and in order to live a better story with our lives. Sometimes that growth can look like the hard work we put into a job, a degree, a relationship, or our faith. Sometimes that hard work or growth looks like a move, ending a toxic relationship, or starting all over again. And sometimes growth will mean caring about the world and people in it, volunteering for causes that you care about, protesting injustice in our community and world, and pushing for healthy change. But I can tell you one thing for sure, none of us would be gathered here today if Jesus had lived a safe, small, quiet life. None of us would be here if Jesus had run away and escaped from every difficulty that he had faced. Jesus chose this tricky, more difficult path, and not because he was like a glutton for punishment, but because he was on a mission for God in the world. We had a dog growing up named Ginger. She was a Jack Russell Terrier, and true to her breed, wouldn't come when you called her, and if she saw something she wanted, would continuously run after it with no thoughts as to how far she was getting away from you. Well, one day our neighbor boys got a little mischievous, and they cut the metal wire in our fence between our house and theirs. And Ginger got her freedom. And it took a long time for my parents to be able to get close enough to Ginger to grab her collar and take her home. And my dad, of course, goes out into the yard to figure out how this happened and finds the fence and repairs it. But for the rest of her life, Ginger would go outside and put her head through each square of the fence where it had been broken, just in the hope that she might be able to escape. And if you've been around Christians or church people, you might have noticed that some of us can be a little bit like my dog Ginger. Some of us can be so focused on escaping the world and its pain that it seems like we're not paying attention to anything else or anyone else. In fact, many Christians will celebrate those who have withdrawn themselves from the world and all of its problems as being more spiritual than the rest of us. But what if that wasn't what Jesus wanted from his followers at all? What if Jesus wanted his followers to be deeply engaged in the world and in its problems and with its people. The text you heard read tonight is a part of Jesus's farewell prayer in John. It's a prayer where Jesus prays for himself, where he prays for the disciples, and for all of those who would come to believe in him. And in this prayer, Jesus says that he had laid out God's character, who God was, how God was in detail for his followers. And now those followers had finally gotten it. They knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus and everything he had said and done must have been from God. And in this prayer, Jesus says he's praying for his followers. Did you hear this one? Not the God-rejecting world. Which is a really interesting phrase, because if you've read Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, which are the texts that tell the story of Jesus' life, who was it who rejected Jesus the most? The religious leaders. The super religious people. That's who rejected Jesus. The godless world. So interesting. And when Jesus uses this term world, he doesn't mean the actual planet, but he's using it to describe the systems, the structures, the cultural beliefs that fell short of God's hope for the world. So yes, Jesus prays that those who follow him would stand against the world's ways, but he is talking about those systems, those structures, those cultures and beliefs that are contrary to God's hope for us and for the world. But at no point does in the text does Jesus say to his followers that they should abandon ship, get out of the world, stay away from its people. In fact, Jesus seems to be praying for the opposite. Jesus says, in the same way you gave me a mission, talking about God in the world, I gave them a mission in the world. And Jesus knew that this wasn't going to be an easy mission, and that's why we also see him praying for God's protection over his followers, because Jesus knew they were kind of going to have to buckle up for a hard and difficult and joy-filled life. Because like Jesus, his followers were not going to be defined by the world, by those systems, by those structures, by the culture, by those norms. They were going to be picking up where Jesus left off and becoming that living, embodied example of what God does hope for the world. So how do we know what that looks like? We can look at Jesus' ministry as recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus publicly claimed his desire to follow God's path and claimed that identity as a child of God in his baptism. Jesus deeply cared about people. He spent less time in religious spaces and more time with people who were outside of those spaces, in need of encouragement, in need of hope, in need of healing. And Jesus didn't want people to feel shame. He wanted them to feel seen. He wanted them to feel heard. He wanted them to feel understood and welcome. Jesus had a beautiful way of giving faith and community back to people who felt like they had been pushed out of it. Jesus reminded well-respected religious people that they were probably going to have to rethink everything they thought they knew about God or religion, and that they were going to have to be willing to be born all over again in their faith. When Jesus healed the sick, he wasn't just healing their ailments. In their culture, sickness and illness, that was a stigma that you must have done something wrong, something against God. And so when Jesus healed people, he also restored them back into community. Jesus cared when people were hungry, and then he made sure they were fed. In a world captivated by power and money, Jesus taught people about loving God and loving their neighbor. And if you've heard the Lord's Prayer, then you might recognize this line that I love. God's kingdom come, God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Doesn't sound like an escape plan to me. So if you decide you want to follow Jesus' ways, then what would that mean? would mean that you had decided you wanted to become a person who was trying to live as a member of God's kingdom where you are. To live a life that tries to make sure that God's will is done in Lawrence as it is in heaven, in the world as it is in heaven. And that's hard work, friends. And if we decide to take this path, some days we are going to need to rest, right? I mean, I want to preach a little rest here too, because thankfully there are plenty of stories in our biblical text of Jesus resting, of Jesus hanging out with friends and having an awesome meal, of Jesus taking naps. Big fan of that. So it's okay to take a nap if you need it. It's okay if you need rest. It's okay if you need to get away on your own to talk to God or be close with friends. Jesus did all of those things too. But I hope you won't try to escape this world or the life that you've been given. I hope you'll choose to stay engaged and make a difference. I hope you'll remain committed to growth. Yes, it will be hard, but I promise you, it will be beautiful too.